God is not going to play you. But if you think you're going to thrive on this journey from setback to impact and income without being courageous, sis, you are playing yourself. Hey there, Beacon. Welcome back to the Bouceback Blueprint Podcast. This is Tiffany Huff-Strothers, your bounce back guide, and I am super excited to be your guide as you thrive on this journey from setback to impact and income. So let's dig in to Cornerstone number 2, courage, the voice of a victor and a posture of power. So listen, what I know for sure is that the power of your story is a very intricate piece of you being able to thrive on this journey from setback to impact and income. And if you are going to use the power of your story, yes, that mess, for God to bless and use you to impact others, then you are going to have to do it with courage. And I really want to start out by sharing with you the focus scripture of the setback to impact and income community, the bounce back blueprint, I should say, community. And that is Isaiah 61. And today I'm going to read verses 1 through 3. Now, verse 1 is actually associated with Cornerstone number 1, and that is having clarity. And if this is your first time joining us, then I suggest you go back and listen to Cornerstone number 1, all about clarity, and then jump back in here to Cornerstone number 2. So I'm going to read Isaiah 61, verses 1 and 1 through 3 verbatim. I'm not going to give you the Tiff's Notes version, but I want to be clear in stating that verse number 1 correlates directly to Cornerstone number 1, clarity being faith and focus are the foundation. And so verse 1 says, "The Spirit of the Sovereign Lord is on me, because the Lord has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim freedom for the captives, and release from darkness for the prisoners." Verse 2, "To proclaim the year of the Lord's favor and the day of vengeance of our God, to comfort all who mourn." Verse 3, "And provide for those who grieve in Zion, to bestow on them a crown of beauty instead of ashes, the oil of joy instead of mourning, and a garment of praise instead of a spirit of despair. They will be called oaks of righteousness, a planting of the Lord for the display of his splendor." So, like I said, verse 1 is ultimately getting very clear and focusing on your faith to know that the Lord has anointed you to do something specific, right? He has called you out to move from setback to impact and income by proclaiming the good news to the poor, right? And so you need to have that courage, or excuse me, that clarity, so that you can lay a solid foundation for this bounce back blueprint journey, right? And then the scripture goes on to say that you are to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor, right? You are to comfort all who mourn, right? You are to give oil of joy instead of mourning. And so that is why it is so important that you have the voice of a victor and the posture of power. Because here's the reality of the situation: it's going to be very challenging for you to impact anyone else if you are still sounding and standing as if you are in the setback. If you still sound like you're mourning, if you still look like you have on a spirit of despair when you are supposed to be blessing others with a garment of praise, then it's going to be challenging for you to impact those that the Lord has anointed you to proclaim the good news to. And I want you to also be clear that this doesn't mean literal poor, right? It says to proclaim the good news to the poor. There are people who are poor in spirit. There are people who are poor in their minds. There are people who have a poverty mindset as it relates to caring for their bodies, taking care of their children, understanding their gifts and abilities. There are people who are poor in esteem, right? There are people who are poor in knowing how to make good decisions. And so I want you to be clear that that is why we have cornerstone number one, that is clarity, so that when you get to the point that you need to stand and scream, if you will, courageously your story to bless those God has called you to, you know what they need, right? You know the news that you are to deliver to them. And so I want to be very clear in that having the voice of a victor and being able to stand in a posture of power means that you have made peace with what you've grown through, and you've also accepted that God has called you to a specific person or group of people for such a time as this, and you have no time to operate in a spirit of fear, because that is not the spirit that God has blessed you with, right? And so I want to give you an idea of what it's going to take for you to have the voice of a victor when you go to those who are poor to deliver that good news, and what it's going to take for you to have a posture of power. And the first thing is you have to give yourself permission to grow and to grieve. Let me repeat that. You have to give yourself permission to grow and to grieve. Here's what I know for sure: we are rarely taught about the grief that is associated with growth, right? When we start out these journeys, we get excited because we finally recognize that God has prepared us for such a time as this, right? And we're ready to grow forward and do and be and have all of the things. But when we are met with the grieving process, oftentimes we are shaken. It causes us to be stalled and we get stuck. And so I want you to know today, at the start of this journey, as you are laying your foundation or as you are beginning again, that growth means grief, right? There is a natural trajectory that you will have some growth, you will have to grieve, and then you can move forward to greatness. And so that means that you need to recognize that there will be some relationships that you need to grieve in this journey as you grow. And these are not only relationships with individuals, these are relationships with behaviors, with mindset and thoughts, with activities, right? And I want to put it into perspective for you this way, right? When you were a toddler, you shopped in the toddlers department, right? And even if you had a favorite pair of jeans, by the time you got to kindergarten, it is unlikely that you were still able to fit said pair of jeans. Now, before you went to school, your mom may have allowed you to continue to wear those jeans, even though she could see they were too small, because they brought you joy. But the reality is, if by the time you get to kindergarten, you are still trying to squeeze into those two toddler jeans, it's going to cause you a lot of pain, perhaps some injury, right? If you aren't willing to recognize the growth you are experiencing and grieving the relationship that you've had with those jeans, even though it's been years, right? Even though you've had some great times with them, you've got all these pictures in those jeans. There is a time and a season for all things. And I want you to keep that perspective when you are experiencing grief in the growing process, as you courageously begin to speak with the voice of a victor and take a stance of a posture of power. Because here's what you will recognize: there will be people who are not excited about this newfound courage that you have. There are some people who are attracted to your brokenness. And when you begin to have a breakthrough, when you begin to grow through and grieve the brokenness so that you can do and be and have what God has called you to, they will get defensive. And I want you to know in advance that that is going to happen. And not that you can necessarily prepare for the grieving process, but you can expect it. Okay, you can expect the grieving process. And you need to recognize that everybody can't go and everybody doesn't want to. The good news, though, the great news, I should say, is that according to Isaiah 61 1 through 3, God has already set aside a group of people that He is calling you to give that good news to, right? So as you grieve, the relationships that you have to release in this season as you grow forward, there will already be people in place that God has called you to, as long as you're in position, as long as you're willing to allow yourself, right, to give yourself permission to grow and to grieve so that you can expand into greatness. So that's number one. Number two, you've got to be an advocate for authenticity. Let me repeat that. You've got to be an advocate for authenticity. That means you've got to wake up every day, right? Knowing, as we discussed in Cornerstone number one, that you have to be famous at home first, right? And so being an advocate for authenticity means that once you know who you are and whose you are and what God has assigned you to do, right? Once you have decided that you are going to courageously commit to moving through this journey so that you can get up out of that setback and build this blueprint to make an impact and an income, it means that you are going to have to be authentic to who God has revealed to you you are and who you are becoming, right? That is why those non-negotiables we talked about in Cornerstone 1 are so important, because as an advocate for authenticity, right, you may bend a little, but you don't break, right? You don't have those moving boundaries, right? You are sure that you know that you know that you know who you are and whose you are, right? And you don't change depending upon who's around. You don't change depending upon where you go, right? You are who you are. And anyone who comes into contact with you sees the light of God, sees the Spirit coming before you, because you are so authentic and true to who you are. And you are an advocate for others to do the same. That is how you will bring joy to those who are mourning. That is how you will replace their ashes for beauty, because your authenticity, the power and presence of God within you, is going to go before you. And that is what will continue to strengthen you to have the voice of a victor and the posture of power. Because when you are uncertain, it is when you start to feel like a victim, because people can shift you, right? Have you second guessing. But when you have that authenticity, and when you consistently advocate for it, your voice becomes louder, right? You become the beacon God has called you to be. And even though people will test and people will push back, that posture of power is what's going to keep you in your stance, right? It's going to let people know that you have on the full armor of God and you are not to be fooled with. They can try it, but it won't work, right? And like I said, you don't want to be the weapon that is forming against you. So you really do want to embrace being this advocate for authenticity. And then last but certainly not least, you have to have the foresight to forgive if you want to courageously be the beacon with a voice of a victor, and the posture of power. Let me repeat that. You have to have the foresight to forgive. And here is why. Like I said, there are going to be people who are going to test your Jesus gangster. There are going to be people who are constantly going to attempt to say, I remember you when. There are going to be people who are going to come up to you and say, remember when we used to fill in the blank. And what you have to do is you have to have the foresight to forgive people. You have to have the foresight to forgive them, because you are going to need to greet them with grace. The reality is, even though you have worked through Cornerstone number one and gotten that clarity, everyone else has not. And that means they don't know who you are, right? Even as you are advocating for authenticity, because they are so unclear, right? They have no focus. They haven't been exercising their faith muscle. And so they don't understand what is happening with you, right? They think it's a phase. They aren't sure it's going to last. And so they are going to taunt you, right? They are going to judge you. They are going to test you, and they will attempt to tempt you. And so you have to greet them with grace. You have to have the foresight to forgive, because the reality is they just don't know who you are, or they don't know whose you are. And in the same breath, right? In the same vein, there are some people who are the exact opposite. There are some people who will know exactly who you are from a mile or two away. There are some people who are right now preparing for who you are advocating to be authentically. They are preparing a plan. They are trying to form a weapon to take you down, to undermine you, to challenge the truth of your story, to use your past or your experience against you, and you have to have the foresight to forgive them as well. The word has already warned that the weapons will formed, but God said the weapons will not prosper. And like I said in Isaiah 61, the Spirit of the Lord is upon you. He has anointed you. This is what you are called to do. And so when you have that foresight to forgive, your voice does not shake, right? You remain victorious in your voice. When you have the foresight to forgive and someone challenges you, your posture doesn't shrink, right? You don't shrink down, you don't bow down. You have a stance of power because you know who you are and whose you are. And in fact, when you are met with opposition, your stance might get even a little stronger. You might straighten your back a bit more, and your voice might get even a little louder, right? Your light might shine a bit brighter because this is what you are called to do. And it is so important for you to embrace this before we move forward. These cornerstones are so important. And so I want you to consider, right? How has your unwillingness to grieve kept you from the greatness that God has already decided is yours? How has your unwillingness to grieve impacted your ability to have and use your voice as a victor? Has your unwillingness to grieve kept you in a place of feeling like you are consistently being victimized so that you aren't sharing your story courageously because you are still stuck in that setback, right? Has your unwillingness to grieve caused you to shrink down and not have the stance of power, the posture of power, right? And then I also want you to get honest with yourself and consider where you are halting your advocacy for authenticity. Where is it that you're going that you're not being your 100% full self? Who is it that you are keeping from knowing who you are and whose you are? Who are you allowing fear to keep you from forgiving so that you are not using the voice of the victor and the posture of power when you encounter them? Because here's the thing. It's time for you to stop tiptoeing around the people and the places and the spaces where God has called you to stomp, right? That is over today. It is time for you to live and walk and be courageous, right? It is a command, in fact, from Joshua 1, and you can go and read the entire chapter, but I'm going to give you the Tiff's notes version of that. Joshua 1, in verses 6 through 9, God says, "Have I not commanded you? Be strong and courageous." It's a command. It's so much bigger than you, right? And one of my life scriptures is Joshua 1, or excuse me, Jeremiah 1 5. And again, Tiff's Notes version. "Before I formed you in your mother's womb, I knew you." Right? I appointed you a prophet to the nations. He made that declaration very clear. What Joshua 1 5 does not tell you is who your nation will be. And until God can trust you with the voice of the victor and the posture of power, you may still not know who your nation is. And that is why you have to take this stance. You have to be willing to grow and grieve. You have to be an advocate for authenticity, and you have to have the foresight to forgive. And so I want to encourage you right now to really get honest with yourself. Spend some time considering the questions that I've asked you. Meditate on those scriptures. And then after you've done that, click the link below and join the Bouceback Blueprint community, because this is a community of women who are going to both encourage and challenge you to be courageous. This is where you are going to get the launch pad to begin to use your voice as the victor that God has called you to be. This is where you are going to have the training ground and a safe space to get that posture of power, right? This is where you can spend some more time with me working through some of these things and digging into the content from the podcast. And it's a free space. It's a it's a judgment-free zone, and it is an opportunity for you to begin to thrive now on your bounce back journey. Before you go, though, one thing, make sure wherever you are listening to this podcast, be it iHeartRadio, Apple Podcasts, Google Play, you go ahead and click subscribe so you can be the first to know when new episodes drop. And please leave a review, rate us, let us know how this episode, these cornerstones, are impacting your life. When you review and rate us, you create an opportunity for another beacon just like you with light and a story to share to find this resource so that she too can thrive on her journey from setback to impact and income. Until next time, beacon, remember, God is not going to play you, but if you ignore the command to be strong and courageous, you are playing yourself.